Another thing that we can look at in terms of similarities are the types of crimes. We know Bundy bludgeoned a lot of his victims to death, and we have Kohberger who stabbed them. So that's an intimate crime. So there's similarities and differences between the two.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Intertextuality in true crime is a fantastic way to gain insight into a crime and into a particular criminal psychology. Of course, you have to get it right for the analogy to work. Those who still see connections to Ted Bundy, in my opinion, still haven't figured out who Kohberger is or what we're dealing with. I mean, it's okay to think that there might be connections in the first couple of weeks, but we are now 7 months later. One reason for this, I believe, is because Kohberger is, in a sense, his own animal. What does that mean? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So in terms of Bundy and Kohberger, I want to start off by evaluating the comparisons between Kohberger and Bundy in terms of why the thinking has gone the way it has gone and why it doesn't really make sense. And I'll put a link in the description if you want to hear the full thing on News Nation. Now, personally, the best argument for bringing Ted Bundy up is if you slightly vision impaired, they do sort of look alike. There's a little bit of curly hair, and Kohberger sort of, looks like a young Ted Bundy. If we go down the scale and we want to force comparisons, I guess one could postulate that they both studied the law in some way. They both worked minimum wage jobs at a certain point. They both found themselves in university settings. They both moved through Washington and Idaho, and their victims included students. Again, that's if you're interpreting the context fairly loosely and selectively. Former FBI agent Tracy Wilder says that Bundy's outstanding idiosyncrasy was his charm, and that he used this, and that's true. And I would add to that to say that his sly intelligence is something that both fascinates us and terrifies us in terms of Ted Bundy. But that is clearly something Kohberger doesn't have, and you don't really get a sense that charm played any role in the Idaho student murders, right? Also, Bundy started out fairly early, at approximately age 23, whereas the prime suspect in the Moscow, Idaho killings seems to be quite a bit older. I think it's also important just to say that one needs to say that he's the alleged killer. We don't know, we can't say for sure at this point that he is. I do think that this lack of charm, which we see coming to the fore in quite a few different anecdotes in his university setting, with his peers, at school, in various work settings, and then also at a restaurant where waitresses were offended, I think that is a big part of maybe who Kohberger is, or wants to be. And so I think the differences between them are more significant than their similarities. Although I often agree with Tracy Wilder's assessment, I don't think I would describe the intimate nature of Bundy's crimes as similar to what Kohberger allegedly did. I mean, it is intimate, but it's a different weapon, which means it's a different kind of intimacy in the aftermath, and there's a different psychology. When you say different psychology, you're talking about the scale of it, the scope of it, the level of it is all different. And Bundy, although Bundy did develop a fascination with knives as a kid, I'm not sure if Bundy ever used a knife in any of his many crimes. And that is actually quite an achievement, to not use a knife once over the course of 20 to 36 victims. Now, I think if you understand the true motive of Bundy and others like Peter Sutcliffe and Dennis Rader, knives are almost completely absent, because what the killer wants is to stun his victim and then take some time for torture or to otherwise engage with them, often sexually. And you have the same thing with Jeffrey Dahmer. We see none of that with Kohberger, although I believe sexual frustration is or was part of the possible motive in the Idaho student murders. I think it's obvious that the experts and blowhards covering the Idaho students' case want to attach Bundy to the case, not because it's part of Kohberger's backstory, but it's part of their own, and possibly also to maximize sensational shock value, the sensational or shock value of this case, as if it's not shocking enough. And more than one creator and expert I've come across while covering this case, I know have written books on serial killers. And so they want to sort of make that part of the conversation. And they want to make that aspect relevant when it really isn't. The BTK argument is a little bit of a better argument, but this ultimately isn't a serial killing, and it never was. And it never met the basic True Crime 101 definition of a serial killing. If you don't know what it is, just Google it. In sum, let me just say it's useful to bring Bundy up, if only to make clear that Kohberger, besides his physical appearance, psychologically is really nothing like Ted Bundy. And that's maybe a good place to start, to then say, okay, well, what is his psychology, right? And so that brings up the question, which intertextualities are useful? Put otherwise, if Bundy isn't useful to figuring out Kohberger, well, who is? And I'm going to go through about 4 or 5 different criminals and look at their psychology, starting with Danny Rawlings. He ticks some of the boxes, such as attacking a student with a K-bar knife. But the fact that there was a classic cooling off period and other aspects in Rawlings' crimes clearly isn't the same as what we saw in Moscow. Dennis Rader, aka BTK. It's interesting, if you abbreviate Kohberger's name, he's BCK. Anyway, Rader taunted the police and the media, and this idea of turning a crime into a kind of symbolic message, into a kind of platform, into a kind of stage, and ultimately a contest between the intellect of the criminal and the cops, is something that feels as if it might be present in the Moscow case. The Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, also seemed to develop a persona that was all about scaring the community and outsmarting or outwitting law enforcement. Richard Speck was 25 years old when he committed a similar mass stabbing of 8 student nurses. The major difference between Speck and Kohberger was that Speck had a prior criminal record and was not affiliated with any academic institution after falling out of Crozier Technical High School shortly after his 16th birthday. The infamous incel Elliot Rodger was a student who killed fellow University of California Santa Barbara students, including with a knife, who was motivated by an idea of psychological and symbolic revenge. Once again, there are areas here of psychology that are similar, but also not quite the same. Rodger's despair was a lot greater, which is why the number of victims was greater and why Rodger took his own life. Kohberger clearly didn't do that. As I noted at the outset, in my opinion, most covering this case still haven't figured out who Kohberger is or what we are dealing with, even after covering him exhaustively after 7 months. One reason for that, I believe, is because Kohberger is, in a sense, his own animal. Kohberger's key traits appear to be that although he comes across as a nervous character, he needs to dominate, not only physically but psychologically. He needs to show he's the smartest person in the room. I feel like I accurately profiled the Moscow, Idaho killer before he was caught and identified. And so it's weird how 7 months down the line there are still comparisons to Ted Bundy and serial killer rumors, which tells me that there's still a serious lack of understanding about who we are dealing with, even after we've spent so many months trying to do exactly that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.